Alright, this is part 2 of Soil, the Home for Plants. We'll talk about soil organic matter for a few moments here. In Florida, our soil organic matter content is usually less than 1% or at most 1%. Sometimes it's even less than that. Usually further north you have 2 to 3 or 4% in very good soils. The organic layer or the organic matter is where a lot of the nutrient holding capacity of the soil exists, not so much on the coarse sand particle. What is soil organic matter? It's that fraction of the soil composed of anything that once was alive. It could be plant, it could be animal remains at various states of decomposition. Cells and tissue of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, you name it. And other substances secreted by plant roots and the microbes themselves. Soil organic matter, you may have called it humus. We'll use those terms pretty much interchangeably. I usually use the term organic matter. A product of degradation followed by synthesis. It has a huge influence on the soil physical and chemical properties. Here's what I was talking about a moment ago. At least 90% of the nutrient holding capacity in South Florida sandy soils comes from that humus. We can probably safely say it's similar in Central Florida. It's an energy source for the soil microorganisms. And as we talked about in botany and taxonomy, a lot of plants have associations with microorganisms in their root systems. So what does organic matter do? It's a carbon energy source for those microbes, hopefully beneficial. It holds the soil particles together. I like to think of it as a soil glue. It improves soil ability to store and transmit air and water, which are critical to plants. It also supplies N, nitrogen, P, phosphorus, and sulfur, which is a necessary plant element for its growth. Retains nutrients by supplying cation and anion exchange capacity. It's kind of to get a little nugget of nitrogen off the particle, you have to exchange something back onto the particle of soil, or for this matter, organic matter, to do so. We'll kind of leave it there for this class, okay? Composting can improve our soil and it adds to the organic matter in the soil, but it will constantly be breaking down in our soil systems. It's a great way to recycle, first of all. About 20% of solid waste in a landfill is yard trash, and sometimes seasonally it can be 80%. Think of the big trucks that went around after the various hurricanes that have blown. Ooh, sorry about the H word. Those named windstorms that have come through Pasco County in the last several years. Most organic materials contain essential minor elements for plant growth. Even though we call it minor elements, that doesn't mean that they're not just as important as those needed in greater quantity. This is an energy efficient way of maintaining plant growth. What can be composted? Many types of organic matter can be readily composted. Some of the materials will provide nitrogen, others will provide the carbon. It's a balance of the carbon to nitrogen or the C to N ratio that's essential for quick and good compost. Few things that should not be ever composted: meat, meat scraps, fat or grease. If you have cooking oil from deep fat frying French fries, don't put that into the compost pile, even if it is a vegetable oil, it's grease. Bones, no dairy products with the exception of eggshells. So, no meat, no grease, no bones. Definitely shouldn't go into the compost pile. First of all, they are attractive to vermin that you may not want in your yard, and they usually produce some kind of objectionable odor in the decomposition process. Carbon to nitrogen ratio is affected by the materials that go into the pile. Ideally, the carbon to nitrogen ratio around 30 to 1 is ideal. This will decompose. If it's greater than that 30 to 1, it'll slow down the decomposition process unless you add a nitrogen source to improve it. I'll talk about that in a second. So what provides carbon and what provides nitrogen? We like to call the brown stuff provides carbon. Now manure, although brown generally, is a nitrogen source. It's the brown things. The green stuff, leaves, kitchen scraps, coffee grounds, although coffee grounds look brown, are what we'll call green stuff. It provides nitrogen. Again, 30 to 1 is ideal. But if you look at a lot of common materials that we'll have to compost in our landscapes, or for that matter in our homes, have a pretty close to that 30 to 1 ideal. Those wastes from cutting up fruit, the little fuzzy bits of something that didn't go quite right, that all is good. Grass clippings, they actually have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, and they break down fairly rapidly. Probably the best way to compost grass clippings, though, is to return them right back to the turf in in the use of a mulching lawnmower. Various leaves are a little higher in the carbon to nitrogen ratio and take longer to break down. Good example are oak leaves. First of all, their carbon to nitrogen ratio is above the 30 to 1, but that doesn't mean you can't compost them, it just will take a little longer. Also, because of that thick waxy coating on the leaves, that slows the microorganisms from getting in and breaking it down. If you can run those leaves over with your lawnmower a few times and chop them up, it'll greatly speed up the decomposition process of those waxy leaves. Rotted manures, we're talking roughly a 20 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. They break down quickly. Let me just say this about manures. We only use those from vegetarian creatures. Please don't compost pet waste. Now, someone probably just got a little grossed out, but I get calls from time to time, people wanting to compost cat litter. I get the idea, great idea, but there are diseases that cats can get that can be transmitted to human beings. Also, you wouldn't want to save your dog manure and compost it either. Again, they're not a vegetarian creature, generally speaking. What about chicken or horse or all that? Well, they are vegetarian creatures and could be composted if you wish. Sawdust or wood. Now, you see the carbon to nitrogen ratio is well above that 30 to 1 at 600. We usually use wood as mulch. That's why mulch takes several months to a few years to break down completely. Probably the best way to compost wood is to use it as a layer for mulch, as in wood chips and things like that. Straw. Generally, we don't have a lot of straw, but some people might have a hay bale from, um, as a decoration, want to get rid of it. It could be composted, but it will take a while because of its high carbon to nitrogen ratio. Notice all our various vegetable table scraps, not the meat, not the grease, not the bones, but the vegetable portions of that. They have a very quick breakdown with a 15 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. Now, I've been talking about carbon to nitrogen ratio quite a bit for the last few moments. I don't expect you to remember all the values here, but remember, compost will eventually happen no matter what. But depending on the exact source of what's going on in the compost, some materials will compost much more quickly than others. Now, generally speaking, the more surface area, it equals faster composting. You put a large branch into a compost pile, it's going to take several years to break down. Chipping it up would speed up that breakdown process. I'm not suggesting most of us should go out and buy a chipper for our backyards. From my experience, most of the home units are just woefully underpowered and really not probably worth sinking your money into them. If you are really into composting, I would suggest a low-end professional model and bypass all the ones you see at the home improvement centers completely. Also say sometimes of the year we may have to add water to the pile, especially during the dry season, which is usually winter and early spring. In doing so, you can turn that into the pile, this will help give the microorganisms the necessary water for them to keep on going. Temperature. It's a function of the size of the of the pile. Usually need to be about 1 yard squared, 1 cubic yard. That's what I'm trying to say. And you have to have oxygen and you have to have the moisture. Not too much, not too little. Ideal ranges are between 122 to 131, give or take. Above 131 to somewhere 140, you may destroy some of the weed seeds or plant pathogens. If the pile gets above about 140 degrees Fahrenheit, you'll start killing off the good microorganisms just by the fact that they get cooked. You can buy special thermometers. Don't use your wife or your spouse or your partner's meat thermometer in your compost pile. Just a word to the wise. They make them and they're about 2 to 3 feet long, the probe, so it gets to the center of the pile to measure the temperature. Aeration is important to give the microorganisms the air that they need in order to grow and break down the composting materials. Periodically turning the pile incorporates air. Now, if you never turn your pile and your pile doesn't get warm, it just kind of takes a very long time to compost down. For those people that have ever seen advertisements for compost in 2 weeks in these systems, they're assuming you're out there quite frequently either turning them or turning over the pile and keeping it everything ideal. I don't think it's possible for most of us to get compost in 2 weeks with those composting systems that are widely advertised. You want to turn it when the temperature gets over 140 so the microorganisms aren't cooked. If you ever get a bad odor, it's usually an indicator of the pile is either wet, too wet, it lacks oxygen, or you may have incorporated something that shouldn't go in there like meat, grease, or bones. There are all sorts of bins out there, and you can go online and you can find all these fancy pictures. I don't know if I would have the energy or ability to build something as pretty as that one, but boy, that's an awful nice one. Now, if I were to design that for me, I probably have made a slightly bigger roof that would have given me more shade from the Florida sun. But hey, you can design it any which way you like. Some people are much more like me. They're relatively frugal. Wooden pallets put together with zip ties or some other system, screws, nails, whatever, can be fashioned into a compost bin. Then you can get all sorts of bins, some of them online, like the lower left hand picture. That one was one from one of those fancy schmancy gardening magazines and one of those mail order type catalogs. And that unit ran back many years ago for well over $100 for some wire that comes together with clip or two. I think that's overrated for what it is. The upper right hand picture is a fairly simple compost bin that can be had for under $30. Not as pretty as maybe the wire cage, but $20 for versus over $100. I'll let you decide which one you like to purchase. Now look at the downfall of this particular model though. These particular models, there is no cover on there, so the heavy rains of summer may need to be, you may need to fashion something to keep the excess rain out of that. Okay? Then there are all sorts of rotating drum units. From my experience, most of them aren't very well made and very durable. Part of that is the roller mechanisms are usually made out of thin metal that rusts. And then the gears that turn it, if there are gears, are made out of plastic. As the compost pile gets heavy, those plastic gears usually get stripped. Some of these rotating drum bin units cost well over $500. I think there are better ideas and better ways to spend $500 than one of these. That's just my personal bias. What happens to our soil organic matter? Why do we have so little in Florida versus most other states in the Union? It's lost through erosion. That's true whether it's up north or down here or anywhere else on the planet Earth. It's used up by soil microorganisms. Think about our soil temperatures. In the summer, they're probably well over 90, almost 100 degrees. Those microbes are very active, breaking down that organic matter, which is their energy or food source. Now, up north, you have 6 months of You got to take a chisel to the ground if you want to get some soil for your potting mix. Oh, you remember my story about that. Right. So it is because we have these high temperatures and pretty much year-round conditions for the microorganisms to break down the organic matter that leaves us with really only the sandy soil or clay behind. Let's conclude part 2 of Soil, the Home for the Plants. Join me for part 3.